The homeless man rasped. "Don't talk, just listen." Evangeline Blackwood froze. She had just stepped out of her black Range Rover when the ragged figure leaning against the brick wall caught her attention. At first glance, he looked like countless other forgotten souls of the city. Dirty clothes, scruffy beard, long tangled hair dripping from the drizzle. But his eyes burned with urgency. Beside him, a loyal mutt growled, staring fiercely into the shadows of the alley. Evangeline's instincts screamed danger, but her hand hesitated inside her Hermes bag where she kept her pepper spray. Something in his tone made her stop. At 53 years after losing her husband in a car accident, she had learned to trust her intuition. And now, alone in this dangerous district to inspect a property she hoped to turn into a shelter, her intuition was on high alert. She studied him a moment longer. He didn't flinch, didn't stagger like someone intoxicated. His voice, though rough, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Behind you," he whispered again. She glanced over her shoulder toward the dark alley. Trash cans lined the wall, rain dripping from their lids, but nothing seemed unusual. Still, her stomach tightened. The dog's growl deepened, his fur bristling. The self-defense training she'd taken after becoming a widow told her to trust both instincts and signals, and both were screaming at her now. The man slowly raised a dirty hand, pointing to the shadows. "He's waiting there," he said softly, lips trembling. "I saw him follow you." Evangeline's pulse quickened. She pressed her back against the car, hand firm on her bag, eyes narrowing toward the edge of the alley. The drizzle thickened into a heavier rain, adding tension to the moment. Evangeline realized she was trapped between two worlds, a millionaire widow shielded by her wealth, and a ragged man society had discarded, warning her about something unseen. She whispered firmly, "Who's there?" Her voice echoed off the wet brick walls. No answer came, only the steady dripping of rain from the rooftops. Evangeline's breathing slowed as she focused on every sound. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. Shoes scraping against pavement, quick and nervous. Her muscles tensed. The homeless man's dog barked once, sharp and fierce, cutting through the moment. Evangeline raised her phone's flashlight and aimed it toward the alley, the beam slicing through the rain. A figure bolted from the darkness. Evangeline reacted instantly, hand going for the spray, but the raspy voice of the homeless man rang out in the chaos. "Don't! He's got a knife!" The stranger lunged forward, a flash of metal catching the weak glow of the streetlight. Evangeline dodged, lifting the spray, her heart pounding. The dog snarled, leaping forward, teeth bared. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Evangeline had to decide, use the spray or trust the warning. That brief hesitation was enough for the fight to begin in full. The stranger stumbled but didn't stop. He lunged closer, knife raised. Evangeline backed away, her foot slipping slightly on the wet ground. Without a second thought, the homeless man shoved himself forward, intercepting the attacker. His ragged body collided with the knife-wielding figure, both of them crashing into the puddles on the ground. Evangeline froze, spray raised, unsure whether to strike. The dog barked and lunged at the attacker, buying precious seconds. The rain poured harder, drenching them all, turning the fight into a chaotic blur of movement and shadows. Evangeline shouted, "Get off him!" But the homeless man grunted, holding the stranger's arm with all his strength. The knife slashed inches from his face, but he didn't let go. Evangeline moved quickly, circling, trying to find a clear angle for the spray without hitting her unexpected ally. Her breath came in short bursts, adrenaline surging. Then something extraordinary happened. With a strength Evangeline never imagined he possessed, the homeless man twisted the attacker's wrist and landed a clean punch to his jaw. The blow was so precise that the man collapsed instantly, unconscious. What she didn't know yet was that Paul, the homeless man who had saved her, carried a secret she would only discover weeks later. The knife slid across the wet pavement, stopping near Evangeline's expensive shoes. She immediately kicked it away, far out of reach. The attacker lay motionless, breathing but completely subdued. Evangeline exhaled, trembling slightly, still processing the danger she had narrowly escaped. The sound of sirens began echoing in the distance. Someone must have called the police. When it was over, she turned to the homeless man. His chest rose and fell with exhaustion, his hair plastered to his face by the rain. His dog sat loyally at his side again, tail wagging faintly as if proud. Evangeline stared at him, struggling for words. "You," she began, then stopped. For the first time in her life of privilege, she realized her life had been saved not by her wealth, not by bodyguards, but by someone society had cast aside as worthless, someone with nothing, who had risked everything. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on her heart. Evangeline lowered her phone slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You could have died," she whispered. The man shrugged, wiping rain and dirt from his forehead. "So could you," he muttered. There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance, just a simple truth. His dog nudged his leg, as if reminding him of the bond that kept them alive one more night. Evangeline felt a pang of guilt for the suspicion she had felt when she first saw him. She had been wrong, and she knew it. She gestured toward her car, thinking he might need help, maybe even a hospital. But the man shook his head. "No hospitals," he said firmly. Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps shame. Evangeline hesitated, torn between duty and respect. She wanted to insist, but something in his tone told her not to. Instead, she opened the trunk of her Range Rover and offered a cashmere blanket she always carried. He accepted it silently, draping it over his soaked shoulders. The dog curled against his side, both of them shivering from the cold. Evangeline crouched to his level, studying him more closely. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, she could see intelligence in his gaze. His earlier words replayed in her mind, precise, urgent, life-saving. She realized he wasn't just another homeless man. He had a story, buried under layers of pain and survival. She wondered how someone like him had ended up here on these streets with nothing but a dog to call family. But there was something else in those eyes, something she couldn't yet decipher. A shadow from the past that would make everything clear later. The question weighed on her, but she didn't ask, not yet. Instead, Evangeline said softly, "Thank you." 2 words, but heavy with sincerity. The man looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring her honesty. Finally, he nodded, his lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. His dog licked his hand, breaking the tension. For the first time that night, Evangeline allowed herself to feel relief. She had been saved by the humanity of someone the world overlooked. The police arrived within minutes, flashing lights filling the street. Officers rushed in, cuffing the unconscious suspect and taking statements. Some glanced curiously at the homeless man, but Evangeline cut off any comment with a look. She owed him more than anyone could understand. When an officer asked who had stopped the attacker, Evangeline simply answered, "He did." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with disbelief and a touch of respect. The homeless man shifted uncomfortably under their stares. He wasn't looking for praise. He wanted to disappear back into the shadows he had come from. Evangeline understood. Before he could slip away, she stopped him. "Wait," she said, stepping closer. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then whispered, "Paul." It was simple, almost fragile, like a truth he hadn't spoken in years. Evangeline repeated it softly, committing it to memory. Paul, the man who had saved her life. As the chaos settled, Evangeline offered him a ride somewhere warm. He refused again, insisting he was fine where he was. She didn't press, but she handed him money from her wallet, not as charity, but as acknowledgement. Paul accepted quietly, his dog's tail wagging at the sight of the bills. Evangeline watched him retreat into the shadows, blanket pulled tight, dog at his side. A sharp ache tugged at her chest, knowing she might never see him again, yet hoping she would. Driving away, she couldn't get his image out of her mind. She replayed the events over and over, the urgency in his voice, the courage in his actions, the selflessness of his sacrifice. He had been invisible to the world, but to her, he had become unforgettable. She realized her duty wasn't only to manage her fortune, but to recognize the humanity in those society ignored. And tonight, that lesson had been written in rain, blood, and courage. Hours later, Evangeline returned to her mansion, soaked and exhausted. When her housekeeper asked what had happened, she kept her answers brief. Some wouldn't believe it, others wouldn't care. But she knew the truth. Somewhere in the city, a homeless man named Paul and his dog were alive. And so was she, because he had chosen to act. It was a story no report could ever truly capture. And deep inside, Evangeline made herself a promise. This wouldn't be the last time she saw him. She would find him again, because heroes come in many forms, and sometimes they wear rags instead of expensive suits. The next morning, Evangeline couldn't stop thinking about Paul. She replayed the scene again and again. The rain, the knife, the raw courage of a man who had nothing. But there was something about the way he had taken down the attacker, so quick, so efficient. How did a man from the streets know how to fight like that? She wanted to know more about him. But the city swallowed men like him so easily. Homeless faces blurred into the background, becoming invisible. Still, Evangeline felt compelled to search. She drove through the same streets, checked alleys, even asked around in shelters. Everyone had heard of the man with the dog, but no one knew exactly where he stayed. Paul remained a ghost hiding in plain sight. Days passed, but Evangeline didn't give up. One night, while driving through a certain neighborhood in her understated Mercedes, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against a crumbling wall. His dog was curled at his feet, ears perking up at the sound of her car. Evangeline stopped and approached slowly. Paul lifted his head, surprised but calm. "I thought you'd forgotten," he rasped. Evangeline shook her head. Not a chance. She handed him a fresh sandwich and some bottled water from an expensive restaurant. He accepted silently, but his eyes softened. It was the start of an unspoken trust. Evangeline sat down on the curb beside him, ignoring the stares of passers-by. "Why did you do it?" she asked after a long silence. Paul didn't answer right away. He scratched the dog's ear, his gaze fixed on the wet pavement. Finally, he said, "Because no one else would, and because you didn't look at me like trash when you saw me." His words struck Evangeline deeply. She realized how often people like him were discarded, ignored, dehumanized. For Paul, that single moment of recognition had been reason enough to risk everything. In the weeks that followed, Evangeline kept finding excuses to look for him. She brought food, a blanket, or sometimes just conversation. Paul was reluctant to share his story, but fragments slipped out. He had once had a steady job, even a small apartment. But life unraveled quickly. An accident, medical bills, the loss of his family, and soon the streets became his only home. But he never spoke about his time in the military. That secret stayed buried, like a scar he wasn't ready to show. Through it all, his dog Charlie had been his anchor. "He saved me more than once," Paul admitted, rubbing Charlie's head. Evangeline understood the weight behind those words. She began to notice how sharp Paul's mind was. He spoke several languages, knew history and literature, and had a perspective on the city she rarely heard. "You're wasted out here," she told him once. He only gave a bitter smile. "The world doesn't want men like me anymore." But Evangeline disagreed. She began to see Paul not as a beggar, but as someone with dignity, courage, and wisdom hidden beneath the grime. Each encounter deepened her respect for him. Slowly, she began to wonder if maybe she was meant to be part of his story. One stormy night, Evangeline found Paul sheltering by a closed shop. The rain pounded like hammers and the cold bit into the skin. She insisted he come with her, just for the night, to the guest apartment in her mansion. He resisted, but Charlie nudged him forward, as if giving permission. Reluctantly, Paul agreed. When he entered Evangeline's property, curious eyes from the staff followed him. Some whispered, some chuckled, but Evangeline stood firm. "He saved my life," she reminded them. That silenced the room. For one night, Paul and Charlie had a roof, warmth, and food. Paul didn't stay long at the mansion, but the experience left an impression. "It felt strange," he admitted later. "Like I didn't belong, but also like I remembered what it was to be human again." Evangeline assured him he had never lost that humanity. Slowly, their bond grew into something more than gratitude. It became friendship. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, the quiet wisdom he carried, and even the way Charlie wagged his tail whenever he saw her. In the chaos of her privileged life, Paul had become her calm. But there was something in the way he moved, the way he carried his shoulders, that hinted at a far more complex story than she imagined. One sunny afternoon, while visiting one of the shelters she funded, Evangeline was startled by shouts coming from the courtyard. Rushing to the window, she saw Paul surrounded by 3 aggressive men trying to steal Charlie. Her heart raced as she ran outside. "Let him go," she shouted. The men laughed at first, but when they saw her determined stance and heard the shelter's security approaching, they fled quickly. Paul had bruises on his face, but Charlie was safe. Evangeline knelt beside him, helping him up. His eyes met hers with silent gratitude, but also shame at being seen so vulnerable. That afternoon, Evangeline stayed longer than she should have, tending his wounds with a first aid kit. "You don't owe me this," he muttered. Evangeline shook her head firmly. "You saved me once. Now it's my turn." For the first time, Paul didn't argue. He let her help. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Evangeline realized this man had become one of the most important people in her life. It scared her, but it also gave her a strange kind of hope. He got new clothes, and he no longer walked like a beggar. In time, Evangeline began inviting him to meet in safe places, like at one of her shelters, where they could talk without judgment. Paul hesitated at first, self-conscious about his simple appearance, but her gentle persistence won. It was during one of these meetings that she noticed something that left her speechless. Charlie, too, had grown attached to Evangeline, often running to greet her with a wagging tail and wet nose. The 3 of them formed an unlikely bond: a millionaire widow, a broken man, and a loyal dog. The city was still cruel, but together they carved out moments of genuine friendship. Evangeline began asking herself a dangerous question. What if Paul could start over? She researched shelters, rehabilitation programs, even temporary jobs. Each time, Paul resisted. "I'm fine here," he would say. But Evangeline could see through the lie. He hadn't yet allowed himself to be helped. Still, she saw the exhaustion in his bones, the longing in his eyes whenever they passed families or warm cafes. He was surviving, not living, and Evangeline wasn't ready to let him disappear into the forgotten corners of another shelter. She wanted more for him, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Then came a turning point. Evangeline was at her foundation when she heard on the news about a missing child in Central Park. Desperate parents had made a public plea, offering a reward for any information. Something in her heart tightened, maybe because she and her husband had never been able to have children. Without hesitation, she called the authorities, offering her foundation's resources to aid the search. Hours dragged by with no leads. Just as hope was dimming, Paul appeared, Charlie tugging eagerly at his side. Evangeline was coordinating volunteers when she saw them. "The child is there," Paul said, pointing to a locked shed at the edge of the park. Evangeline was skeptical, but she trusted him. "How do you know?" she asked. Paul simply pointed at Charlie. He smelled something. Breaking open the shed with the help of firefighters, they found the terrified but unharmed boy inside. Authorities looked on in disbelief. Once again, the man no one trusted had saved a life. Paul simply walked away, whispering, "The dog knew." Evangeline couldn't stay silent anymore. She called after him. "Paul, people need you. Not just me, everyone." He froze, then slowly turned, his eyes searching hers. She continued, "You have more to give than you realize. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." And that's when she saw it. For a brief moment, the military posture returned. Shoulders straight, chin lifted. There was a soldier hidden beneath that weathered exterior. Her words struck him harder than any storm ever had. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. Not just wandering, not just surviving, but helping, belonging, being seen. Charlie barked once, as if agreeing. Paul didn't respond, but his silence was heavy with meaning. The next day, Evangeline spoke with contacts at the foundation she ran. She explained everything: the night Paul saved her, the child in the shed, the countless small acts of courage. At first, there was skepticism, but Evangeline's persistence won them over. "All right," they said. "We'll meet him. When Paul was brought in, he looked uneasy under the fluorescent lights, gripping Charlie's leash tightly. But Evangeline stood beside him, introducing him not as just anyone, but as a hero. Slowly, disbelief turned into consideration. For the first time, Paul wasn't invisible. He was recognized. The foundation offered Paul a chance, part-time work as a community mediator and translator. In their conversations, Evangeline had learned he spoke multiple languages. At first, Paul resisted, but Evangeline gently encouraged him. "This isn't charity," she said. "It's your purpose." Finally, Paul agreed, though nervously. But something had changed in him since that conversation in the park. There was a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. His first day was rough. Stares, whispers, doubts. But when he helped a frightened immigrant family explain their case to the authorities, slipping easily between English and Spanish, everything shifted. People saw his worth. Evangeline watched from a distance, pride swelling in her chest. For the first time in years, Paul wasn't just surviving. He was living, but the true transformation was still to come. A week later, Evangeline arrived at the foundation and barely recognized the man greeting her at the front desk. Paul was there, but he looked completely different. His hair had been cut and neatly styled, revealing a strong jawline that had once been hidden beneath a wild beard, now trimmed with precision. He wore simple yet new, well-fitted clothes provided by the foundation, a light blue shirt that made his eyes stand out and dark trousers that showed off his naturally upright posture. But it was the transformation in his eyes that left her speechless. The hopelessness was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that made her heart race. "Evangeline," he said, and even his voice sounded different, firmer, more grounded. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to process the dramatic change. This was no longer the ragged man she had once found in the rain. This was Paul, truly Paul, as he was always meant to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing straight with pride, and wearing a smile that completely transformed his face. For the first time, Evangeline saw the man behind the tragedy. And he was devastatingly handsome. You look," she stammered, heat rising to her cheeks. "Different?" he asked, a hint of humor in his voice, something she had never heard from him before. "Incredible," she whispered, blushing even harder. Paul smiled, a real, warm smile, and Evangeline felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude. It was attraction, pure and undeniable. And deep inside, she wondered, who was this man, really? And what else was he hiding? Weeks turned into months. Paul became part of the team. His skills, intuition, and courage made him invaluable. Slowly, he began rebuilding not only his role in society, but also his sense of self. Charlie remained faithfully by his side, now affectionately known as the Foundation's unofficial mascot. Evangeline watched his transformation unfold, and with it, her feelings grew deeper. She realized she didn't just admire Paul, she cared for him in ways she hadn't expected. It scared her, but she no longer wanted to hide it. One evening after a long day of work, Evangeline found Paul outside the foundation, staring at the city lights. She approached quietly, Charlie wagging his tail at her arrival. "You look different," she said softly. Paul chuckled. "Cleaner clothes, maybe?" Evangeline shook her head. "No, you carry yourself differently, like someone who belongs." Paul went quiet, then whispered, "That's because of you." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Evangeline's heart skipped a beat. Brick by brick, the walls around her heart were crumbling. But Paul still carried secrets. Sometimes she caught him staring off, lost in memories that clearly haunted him. And there was the question of how he had managed to knock out that attacker with such precise skill. One evening, while they were organizing files together, Paul froze at the sight of a photo of veterans displayed on the foundation wall. "Paul?" Evangeline asked gently. "Are you okay?" He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. "I served," he whispered. 3 years in Afghanistan. The truth spilled out like a dam breaking. Paul had been a decorated soldier, a respected sergeant, but war had left scars no doctor could heal. When he returned home, The memories haunted him, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the inability to adjust to civilian life. One by one, everything unraveled. I lost it all, piece by piece, he confessed. My job, my apartment, even my family couldn't understand me. Evangeline took his hand gently. But you didn't lose your humanity or your courage. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way he had protected her, the way he had saved the child, the way he carried himself. He was a protector by nature. Paul looked at her with raw vulnerability. Don't you see? I'm broken, Evangeline. Damaged. No, she said firmly. You're a survivor. And maybe that's exactly what I need. In that moment, something shifted between them. It was no longer a wealthy widow helping a homeless man. It was two wounded souls finding healing in each other. For Paul, belonging wasn't about money or status. It was about Evangeline and Charlie, the family he never thought he deserved. Together, they had built something unbreakable. The city still whispered, but he didn't care anymore. He had found his home. Months later, the city council approached Paul with an unexpected offer. They wanted him to lead a new program for homeless veterans. The salary was substantial, the position prestigious. They want me to testify before Congress next month, Paul told Evangeline, still stunned. About veteran services and homelessness prevention. Evangeline felt a surge of pride, but also a flicker of fear. His success could take him away from her, away from their quiet moments and shared mission. This is incredible, Paul. You deserve this recognition. But Paul shook his head. I can't do this alone. I need someone who understands both worlds, the world of influence and the world of the forgotten. He turned fully toward her. Evangeline, I need you, not just for this program, but for everything. The night before Paul's first television interview, they sat together in Evangeline's garden. Charlie dozed peacefully between them, a living reminder of their journey. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Evangeline admitted softly. After my husband died, I thought that part of my life was over. Paul reached for her hand. I know the feeling. After the war, after losing everything, I thought hope was gone. What changed? She asked. You saw me, he said simply. You saw me in the gutter and still believed there was something worth saving. Tears filled her eyes. You saved me too, you know. I was drowning in guilt and grief, trying not to feel anything real. And now? She looked at him, really looked at him. The strong jawline, the gentle eyes that had seen too much yet still chose compassion. The hands tender with Charlie, but capable of protecting when it mattered. Now I want to live again. 1 year later, Paul stood before a packed auditorium at the United Nations. He was addressing a global summit on homelessness and veteran affairs. Evangeline watched from the front row, her heart swelling with pride. Homelessness isn't about lack of shelter, Paul said, his voice echoing through the hall. It's about lack of connection. It's about being invisible, about society deciding you don't matter. He paused, his eyes finding Evangeline's. But if one person truly sees you, really sees you, it can change everything. If one person believes in your worth, it can bring your life back in every possible way. The standing ovation lasted minutes, but Paul's eyes never left Evangeline. Later, at the reception, diplomats and officials crowded around him, eager to discuss funding and programs. Evangeline watched from across the room, in awe of his transformation. This was the same man she had found broken in the rain. But when a reporter asked about his greatest motivation, Paul's answer silenced the room. My greatest achievement isn't this program or this recognition. It's learning that love doesn't see status or past failures. Love sees the soul. And sometimes, if we're lucky, someone sees ours and decides it's worth fighting for. 3 months later, on a quiet evening, Paul and Evangeline walked through the very neighborhood where they had first met. The once dangerous alley had been transformed into a small park, part of their joint initiative to restore forgotten corners of the city. Charlie bounded ahead, older now but still energetic, chasing autumn leaves in the wind. Do you remember that night? Paul asked, stopping at the spot where he had once saved her life. Every detail, Evangeline replied. The rain, the fear, the moment I realized you weren't who I thought you were. Paul dropped to one knee, and for a moment, Evangeline thought he was tying his shoe. Then she saw the small velvet box in his hands. "Evangeline Blackwood," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You gave a broken soldier a reason to believe in tomorrow. You saw a homeless man and chose to see a human being worth saving." Tears streamed down her face as he continued. "I know I'm not the husband you lost. I can't replace what you had, but I can promise this. Every day for the rest of my life, I will choose to see the beautiful, generous, extraordinary woman who saw past my rags and straight into my heart." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. "Will you marry me?" Charlie barked once, as if adding his approval. Through her tears, Evangeline whispered, "Yes." Their wedding 6 months later was unlike anything society pages had ever covered. The ceremony was intimate, held at the community center they had built together, with only a handful of guests. Paul's best man was Marcus, a veteran and former homeless man who had become the program's first success story. Evangeline's maid of honor was Sarah, a young social worker inspired by their story to dedicate her life to humanitarian causes. And of course, Charlie served as ring bearer, proudly carrying the rings on a custom cushion tied to his collar. In his vows, Paul said, "They say love is blind, but I disagree. Love sees everything, the flaws, the pain, the broken pieces, and chooses to stay anyway." Evangeline didn't love me in spite of my past. She loved me because of how it shaped me into someone worthy of love. Evangeline's response was simple yet profound. "Paul taught me that wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you give. And sometimes the richest people are those who've lost everything because they've learned what truly matters." The Paul and Evangeline Blackwood Foundation became a national model for veteran and homeless services. Their approach, addressing not just housing but also mental health, job training, and community integration, boasted an 85% success rate. Paul's book, Invisible No More: A Soldier's Journey from the Streets to Purpose, became a bestseller, with all proceeds funding their programs. 10 years later, Charlie passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the two people who had given him the best life a once-abandoned dog could ever have. At his memorial service at the foundation, hundreds came to honor the dog who had once saved a life, and, in doing so, had helped save countless others. Paul and Evangeline, their hair now touched with gray, but their purpose still burning bright, spoke about how Charlie had been the bridge between two worlds, the catalyst for their meeting and the living symbol of loyalty and unconditional love. "Charlie never saw homelessness or wealth," Paul said. "He just saw people who needed love and protection. In that way, he was the wisest of us all." A year later, they adopted another rescue dog, a timid German shepherd named Hope, found wandering the same streets where Paul had once lived. As the sun set over the city they had helped transform, Paul and Evangeline sat together on their porch, Hope between them, listening to the sounds of children laughing, families gathering, life being lived fully. "Any regrets?" Paul asked, taking Evangeline's hand. She squeezed it gently, her wedding ring catching the fading light. "Just one." Paul raised an eyebrow. "I wish I could go back and thank that frightened woman who almost sprayed pepper spray at a homeless man in the rain. She had no idea she was about to meet the love of her life." Paul laughed, rich and full of joy. "I wish I could thank that broken soldier who chose to speak instead of staying silent. He had no idea he was about to discover what he was really fighting for." As night settled over the city, they remained on the porch, surrounded by the life they had built together. A life that began with a whispered warning in the rain and grew into a love story that touched thousands of lives. And in that moment, as Paul and Evangeline sat in peaceful silence, they knew that some stories never end, they just keep growing, touching new hearts, proving again and again that heroism comes in many forms. And sometimes the most profound transformations begin when someone simply chooses to see. Thank you for listening.